Chapter 1, April 1st, 2002. A male classmate crashed into ISA as he rushed through the hallway. He sent her careening into another student, who cried out in surprise as ISA's shoulder slammed into him. The boy who'd knocked into her turned, mouth open for an apology, as her books tumbled to the floor. ISA grimaced as pain bloomed in her shoulder. She knelt down, trying to focus on her dropped books. The boy dropped to follow suit, but he fell unsteadily and ended up knocking heads with her. She cursed under her breath as he stuttered out apologies.
Oh man, I didn't mean to. You okay?
Awkward fingers touched the tender spot on her forehead. She brushed him off and collected her things. I'm fine, she murmured. It's okay. He managed to hand her a notebook before she got to it. She pushed the books back to her chest and looked up. The boy smiled sheepishly. He brushed a strand of wildly dyed orange hair back from his face.
Sorry,
he said before half bowing his head and dashing off down the hallway again. ISA awkwardly smoothed out her skirt as she got to her feet. She turned back to the doorway beside her. The number tacked to it matched the one on her schedule. The two sliding doors rested open to reveal dozens of students already sitting atop desks and lounging against windowsills in those precious moments before the first bell. They certainly looked like freshmen.
Need some help?
ISA turned her head to find herself staring at a tie. She tilted her gaze up to meet the eyes of a tall young man, his short hair lazily spiked and a disarming smile on his face. He raised his eyebrows. I don't think so. ISA folded her schedule and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Just looking for my homeroom.
You're here? Cool.
He tilted his head.
You pick a seat yet?
So we pick seats, too. They're pretty lenient here.
I know! I've never been to a school that let me keep my spikes. There was a kid with crazy orange hair running around. It was pretty weird.
I saw him.
Cool.
He smiled again.
What's your name?
ISA paused a moment. Watanabe, she said at last. ISA Watanabe.
Watanabe-san. May I sit next to you in class?
ISA paused again. I guess so, she murmured as she maneuvered around him and through the doors. She found a few open desks near the back of the room, so she rested her books upon one and sat down. The boy took the seat beside her and smiled even more brightly than before, if that were possible.
By the way, I'm Sachi.
He quickly tapped a thumb to his chest.
If you need anything, just ask, okay? You seem like a nice girl.
ISA paused once more. Sachi-kun?
Nah, Sachi's fine.
Sachi. How could she seem like a nice girl? She'd barely completed a half-dozen sentences. The concept dawned on her more slowly than she would have liked to admit. Was he hitting on her? On the first day of school? When she didn't even know his... Wait, she did. Sachi. ISA swallowed and slumped in her chair. So much for staying invisible. But why her? She wasn't pretty, and she hadn't said anything interesting.
Are you okay?
ISA frowned and closed her eyes. Fine, Sachi-kun. Sachi. I'm just tired.
Yeah, isn't it way too early? Everyone's half asleep.
She rounded her shoulders inward, hoping that the action would gently dissuade him from asking so many questions. It worked.
Try and catch a few minutes of shut-eye.
Sachi said gently. His arm brushed her own as he passed by. A moment later, ISA heard him greet some students on the other side of the classroom. ISA relaxed. She hadn't actually been that tired, but closing her eyes made her remember the loud dorm neighbors who had kept her up the night before. She let her insides calm, the steady drone of chattering classmates turning to syrup in her ears. It's okay, she thought. Everything is going to be okay. She felt herself drifting off ever so slightly. Isa jumped in her seat. Heart racing, her head jerked to the middle-aged woman who'd thrown the door shut behind her. The students quieted. Dozens of sets of eyes followed the woman as she stomped to the front desk. She dropped her book bag onto the desktop with a loud clunk. She looked up through half-lidded eyes.
First bell hasn't rung,
she said in a mildly slurred voice.
Get the talking out of your systems now.
She fell into her seat, opened her bag, and pulled out a bottle of what looked like aspirin. The talking in the class slowly returned. Isa, the thundering in her heart still pounding in her ears, panted and looked down at her desk. A large bug stared back at her from the desktop. Her eyes widened as the artificial lights in the room flashed off the insect's shining back. Damn it! She slammed a hand down over the bug. With her heart in her throat, she quickly scanned the students nearby. Nobody noticed her. Sachi was talking to some boy and everyone else seemed fairly occupied, so Ayase curled her hand and reminded herself to breathe. She swallowed hard. The first bell rang as the door slid open.
Joe was still too tired to properly survey the room. Since the students were scrambling into their seats as the bell echoed, he picked where the population was sparsest, the back. He found a seat 2 desks away from some silent kid with a blank look on his face and behind a tall student with spiked hair. Joe fell into his chair, dropped his books to the floor, and promptly clunked his head upon the desktop.
Welcome to Fukuhashi High School.
Came the tired introduction from the front of the room.
I'm Miwa Hamada, your homeroom teacher. The principal of Fukuhashi doesn't believe in opening ceremonies, but if you've looked at your schedules, you probably know that every morning, one full period will be devoted to homeroom to keep you informed of school events and regulations. It's also an open period for study, quiet talking, etc. Since I feel like a train hit me this morning, you can do whatever you want, as long as you keep it down. Any questions? No.
The tips of Joe's lips curled upward. He knew a hangover when he heard one. Joe looked up as the teacher scraped her chair back and left the class. He felt a wave of unusual affection. The teacher reminded him of his second-to-last foster mother. He learned all the cool stuff in his life when he'd stayed with her. Blinking sleep from his eyes, Joe scanned his classmates. About 40 in all, maybe a few more boys than girls, some definitely prime game if their vacant conversations were any indication. There was a kogal with short, reddish-dyed hair nearby, adorned with loud, jingling bracelets and an expensive cell phone hanging from her bag. She definitely wasn't paying enough attention. Joe double-checked for witnesses in his immediate vicinity. His gaze fell on the silent kid 2 seats down. The boy stared blankly ahead, hands in his lap, book bag closed and untouched. He looked like something out of a zombie movie. "Hey," Joe said in an attempt to seem friendly. "Stay up late last night?" The boy didn't move. "Hey," Joe said again, louder. "You alive over there?" The boy blinked once and flicked his eyes toward Joe, as if hearing him for the first time. He stared a moment, saying nothing before moving his eyes back to stare down at his desk. Joe frowned. "Damn," he thought. "That was rude as hell." "Forget it," he muttered. Joe looked back to the girl with the reddish hair. She was flirting with a classmate, gesturing with long-nailed fingers as she spoke. A few other students chatted around them, but a desk sat unoccupied nearby. Joe got up and made for that desk.
Have you tried the food yet? It's pretty bad. How is the food at your old place?
Joe glanced at Spike as he passed. The boy was flirting with an ordinary-looking girl who seemed not only confused, but really uncomfortable. Joe once again wondered why anyone bothered flirting on the first day of school. The first day was to survey. Check the layout, feel out the students, or, in Joe's case, to case the joint. Joe took the desk near the kogal, dropping his book bag beside hers. He made sure to catch the eye of the boy she flirted with and briefly flash his hand in a no-weapons stance. Joe raised an eyebrow approvingly. The boy smirked. "Mind if I sit here?" Joe made sure to ask both the girl and the boy at the same time. He tilted his head at the silent kid in the back. "I just want to read, and he's creeping me out." Neither minded. That guy was weird. Looked like a druggie. Better to stay the hell away from him. Joe thanked the two of them and pulled a magazine from his bag. He flipped it open on his desk. Their guards were successfully down. Neither member of the couple paid Joe much attention after that, not even when, 5 minutes later, he bent to switch the magazine and slid the girl's cell phone up his sleeve. Hamada-sensei didn't return until a few minutes before the bell rang. By then, Joe had gotten the kogal's wallet and the cell phone of the guy she'd been flirting with.
Ayase's focus was wasted on her classes that day. She hadn't expected to learn much on the first day of school, but nothing. Not less than nothing, considering her second period teacher didn't even manage to finish taking attendance. It was uncomfortable. She'd heard that Fukuhashi was a pretty wild place. It was completely funded by the government and had the lowest admission standards in Tokyo, so obviously it had its fair share of soon-to-be dropouts and slummers. The unsupervised dorms were packed with students who were no longer welcome at home, or never had a home to begin with, which explained the loud partying that had kept her up the night before. But it seemed that Fukuhashi was also the last resort for the teacher population. Ayase's angry language teacher couldn't find his lesson plan, her stuttering math teacher was clearly ravaged by anxiety, and her elderly classics teacher was borderline senile. Ayase tried to pay attention and record anything that seemed important, but by lunchtime she was left with effectively useless notes. Half of them sounded like the classics teacher's directions for a class that no longer existed. Ayase sighed. As her classmates whooped and jumped out of their chairs at the announcement of lunch, she clapped her notebook shut and slid it back into her book bag. "Won't need you anymore," she thought.
Did you bring your lunch, Watanabe-san?
Ayase threw a sidelong glance at Sachi. Hadn't he lost interest in her yet? No, she murmured. I was going to... She trailed off as she stood, her hand sliding into her pocket. She gripped her change and it made an audible jingle. He smiled at her, for the 30th time that day.
Sure!
He chirped.
Do you know where the cafeteria is?
I'll find it. She excused herself with a stiff bow, then made a beeline for the door. It wasn't until she was halfway down the hallway that she finally breathed easier. Damn it. She sighed and followed the signs that pointed to the cafeteria. If she ate in the classroom, was Sachi going to sit with her? She'd kept an eye on him during the day. Whenever she brushed him off, he barely blinked before chatting with someone else. She hoped he was one of those boys who went into knee-jerk flirtation mode at the sign of a new girl. That meant he would probably move elsewhere if she was unresponsive enough. The short hallway that led to the cafeteria was a complete bottleneck. Students ran past ISC excitedly, jostling her back and forth as they rushed the double doors. When she finally squeezed her way into the cafeteria, she found herself in a sea of chattering classmates, numerous enough to break any fire code. The line for food was a nightmare. ISC noticed a few vending machines against one wall, so she opted for speed over quality. She passed a table surrounded by a throng of older students. A pretty upperclassman with bleached hair was sitting atop the table and smiling coyly at her fans. Based on their cries, they thought they were at a strip club. Ayase tried to ignore them and the bad taste they left in her mouth. One of the vending machines had sandwiches in it, so Ayase bought one of the few that remained. She punched in the code for a tea in another machine but received some sort of sports drink. She was debating whether or not to keep it when someone thrust a milk carton into her face.
Want to trade?
A classmate in a must uniform waggled the carton back and forth.
That damn machine never spits out what you order. Milk gives me the shits.
Ayase preferred milk to the purple substance in her hand. She handed him the sports drink and accepted his carton. To her surprise, he suddenly grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer.
Hey!
He smiled like a predator, revealing several missing teeth.
You're a freshman? Can you lend me some money for smokes?
Ayase was too surprised at the sudden contact to reply. When he took advantage of her silence to wrap an arm around her waist, her surprise turned to alarm and she jerked backward. Don't do that, she said quickly. The boy whistled through his missing teeth.
What? I'll pay back.
A tall upperclassman suddenly loomed over them.
Sato-kun,
He said evenly.
you've been warned about this.
Ayase's assailant let her go, his wide eyes flying upward.
I was just trading.
He said quickly, holding up the sports drink in his defense.
See, I wasn't bothering nobody, senpai.
The upperclassman's cool gaze never shifted as he snapped gloved fingers. He jerked his thumb behind him. The teen bolted in that direction, properly punished. Ayase knelt to retrieve her milk. Thank you, she murmured as she stood. She felt weirdly embarrassed and she wasn't sure why. The upperclassman smiled down at her.
This school is swarming with wolves.
He warned quietly.
Either find your own pack or hide behind something bigger.
The cryptic tone of the message bothered her. That, and the black gloves the upperclassman wore, that made him look like a burglar, and she could think of no reason someone would wear gloves to school. His smile did nothing to suppress her creepiness alarm. Right, Ayase mumbled before slipping away. She passed the crowded table again. Someone had brought a stereo and turned on a throbbing dance track. The boys were hooting so loudly that they drowned out the squeaking lunch monitor who was trying to break up the mob. Once she was successfully in the hallway, Ayase checked her purchases. She'd crushed her sandwich a little and her milk carton was dented, but at least her lunch was still in one piece. She let out a breath. That was awful, she thought. She vowed to never venture into the cafeteria again. The trip away from the cafeteria was substantially quieter. In the new calm, she rediscovered how tired she was. By the time she reached her classroom, she wanted nothing more than to curl up in an empty corner and eat her food in peace. Sachi looked up the moment she stepped inside.
Hi!
He called as he gestured for her to sit with him. Damn it, Ayase thought.
Joe was doing well. He leaned against the inside of the bathroom stall and flipped through the paper money in his hand. Damn, he thought as he dragged deeply on his cigarette. Half a dozen kids. Oblivious little bastards. He shuffled through his empty wallets. He dumped them around school grounds with the IDs and credit cards still inside. No use for those. He was still deciding whether or not to sell the cell phones or just ditch those too. Going straight for cash seemed lucrative enough. Someone entered the restroom. Joe listened for a moment to the footsteps. Definitely not purposeful enough to be a teacher, then went back to smoking. His stall door was closed anyway. He'd learned that most guys weren't willing to poke into another guy's stall for any reason, let alone narking about a cigarette. The footsteps stopped. Joe paused, then quickly slid his stolen goods back into varying pockets. Half a second later, the footsteps flew to his stall and an eye appeared at the hinge.
Dude!
Said a voice.
Who is that in there?
Joe snorted. Get lost.
Those cigarettes?
You a pervert? The intruder tried to wiggle a finger into the thin crack and failed.
Help me out?
He asked.
Just one, man.
Joe sighed. He pulled a stick from his cigarette box and tossed it over the door. He noticed it hit the floor before the mystery fingers got to it.
Thanks, bro.
Joe heard a lighter snap.
You don't have anything that'll help me get baked, do ya? I don't know how I'm gonna get through today sober.
I think it's time to go. Joe dropped his cigarette in the toilet and pushed open his stall door. A student about his age with wild orange-dyed hair looked up from lighting Joe's gift. The boy smiled around the stick.
You're a lifesaver.
Joe shrugged it off. Forget it, he murmured as he left the bathroom. He didn't particularly want the stranger to remember him, but figured there was little to no risk of getting reported by a stoner. The homeroom doors in the hallway stayed open for the lunch period. Joe didn't see any teachers or anyone patrolling the hall, and there was some kind of dull crowd noise coming from the cafeteria, which was possibly where the teachers and monitors were. There were a lot of students skipping between classrooms with meals in hand, so Joe made a mental note. Lunch could be a good time to rifle through ignored book bags. A girl suddenly bumped into him as his eyes roamed the classes.
Sorry,
She chirped as she brushed past. Joe glanced at her, then stopped. Whoa. She was hot. More importantly, she was working her hot. Her skirt was rolled up and her blouse was expertly tucked around tight curves. She brushed a strand of bleached hair behind her ear and turned a bit to Joe's admiring glance.
Can I help you?
She asked. Joe flashed a smile. Just promise you'll never apologize to me again. She seemed to like that. She blew him a kiss before breezing down the hallway. Joe let out a breath and took a moment to compose. Upperclassman, he thought as he at last made his way to Class D. With those legs. He was still focused on his casing mission, but he didn't mind brief distractions when they had asses like that. His homeroom was right where he left it, looking rather empty. Apparently most of Class 1D preferred to eat elsewhere. He flopped in his seat, pulled a convenience store onigiri from his bag, and peeled off the plastic as he listened in.
I think it makes me look bad.
Kawa-sensei was staring at my chest the whole
I work
class,
after school.
I
What about
swear.
Sunday?
Blah, blah, blah. Joe tucked his seaweed wrap as neatly as possible as he looked around. The Kogal and her boyfriend were gone, and the two other classmates he'd robbed from Class D seemed fine. He turned his head. The quiet kid with the zombie stare was nowhere to be found.
It's a nice place, full of students. The music's really good, too.
Joe's ears perked. It was Spike, leaning in his seat toward his quiet female target. The guy seemed pretty bad at flirting, and it wasn't like the girl was a catch. Why all the effort? Joe tried to block out the other sounds of the room and zero in.
It opens at around 5. Have you ever gone clubbing, Watanabe-san?
I thought people go to clubs to drink.
Not this one. They don't serve alcohol because it's a club for teenagers.
Oh.
Did you go to dances in middle school? What do you do for fun?
She stopped a moment.
I don't know.
She said at last.
Read, I guess.
Do you have any friends around here?
No. Nobody I knew in junior high or my children's home came to this school.
Sachi went silent.
That sucks.
He murmured.
I know how you feel. I was with a foster family in Aichi until the end of 7th grade. A lot of my friends from my Tokyo middle school didn't come here either.
Joe bit into his rice ball. Maybe that whole thing about Fukuhashi's student population having 20% foster kids was true.
Back to square one with friends, huh?
I guess.
Then let me start.
Sachi smiled broadly.
I'd be honored to be your friend, Watanabe-san.
The girl paused.
You can call me Ayase, Sachi.
She answered quietly.
To be fair.
She added.
Have you seen my wallet?
Joe froze. His eyes carefully rolled to a nearby classmate who was patting himself down. Joe crammed the rest of his rice in his mouth and slipped the packaging into his bag. He scooted his chair up to Sachi and Ayase. Hey, he smiled coolly. Mind if I join you? Instead of making an excuse or even giving him a dirty glare, Sachi only smiled.
Sure,
He replied.
What's your name?
Joe said at last. Ayase and Sachi, right?
Right.
Joe briefly met eyes with Ayase. Up close, he was even more sure she wasn't pretty.
Where are you from, Joe?
Huh? Joe was trying to keep half an ear on the kid looking for his wallet. Tochigi, originally. I've bounced around Chiba most of my life, though.
Are you living in the dorms?
Joe didn't actually want to talk to Sachi. The guy he'd robbed was getting panicky. Damn, he'd picked some weak-hearted nerd. Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
That place you were talking about, the club. Joe raised his eyebrows. Where is that exactly? Ayase sighed and rested her head on her desk.
You're a clubber?
She mumbled, although she didn't look like she cared about an answer. Just want to know where to spend Saturday nights. Oh, Joe was a clubber. Throngs of rich kids, loud music, bare lighting. It was like dipping his hand in a damn money jar.
It's down in Harajuku,
Sachi explained.
It's pretty new. They only let in high school kids and older, so you need your ID.
And no booze? What about smoking?
We're only allowed in because they don't sell that stuff. I think some people bring their own, and I've seen people smoking, but it's not any worse than the dorms here. Hey!
Sachi snapped his fingers at Joe.
You want to go tonight? You know, the three of us? If we go at 6, we can't be out too late.
Joe tried not to roll his eyes. Yeah, he thought sarcastically. I'll just hit on this girl all morning and then invite another random guy to go out with us. Sure, Joe replied dryly. Sachi turned to Ayase.
And you?
She didn't lift her head from the table. Joe noticed the panicky kid had left to check the lost and found at the office, so it was time to get out of sight. He pushed his chair back. I've got to go to the bathroom, he said as he stood. So what, 5:30 in the student lounge?
Sure. Do you have a roommate, Joe?
Yeah.
What's his name?
Damn it, he had to leave. Yoshi Honda or something?
Kiyoshi Honda?
Yeah, that's it. Sachi brightened.
Wow! Do you think you could bring him? I haven't seen him in forever.
Sure. Joe nodded at the two of them and quickly left the classroom. He made it to the bathroom just as he noticed his victim turning back into the hallway. Joe pushed the restroom door shut behind him. Letting out a breath, he fumbled for a cigarette and pushed it between his lips. Damn. That Sachi kid had quite the mouth. Still, Joe noted his own mistake. He'd pickpocketed too many classmates in his homeroom on the first day. He'd lay off at school for a few days, and he had to lose those wallets. He checked to make sure no one was in the bathroom before lighting up and pulling his spoils from the recesses of his clothes. The panicking nerd had navy faux leather, right? He flipped through his goods. Joe frowned. He flipped through the wallets again and again. He knew he had 7 of them, half a dozen procured in his own, but he was down to 6. He started patting himself down. No dice. The wallet of the kid he'd been running from was gone.
5:20. Ayase stared at her alarm clock, closed her eyes, then opened them again. The bleary numbers were still the same. She groaned. Had she napped at all? The dorms were loud in the afternoon, possibly louder than they'd been at night. She yawned before groggily rolling to sit. She wanted to sleep. She rubbed her eyes and tried to decide whether to cancel her evening plans or not. She'd still not met nor seen her roommate. A strong scent of perfume and makeup hung fresh in the air, so Ayase figured the girl must have stopped in at some point. At least that means I slept, she thought. Ayase paused a few moments, then sighed. She couldn't ditch Sachi. The guy had put in a heroic effort to cheer her up all day. He was nice without being creepy about it, so she figured it would be cruel and a little suspicious to reject a harmless outing for no reason. And it wasn't like they were going to be alone, which decreased the likelihood of things getting uncomfortable. Ayase stretched and went to change. She located a pair of newish jeans and a simple t-shirt in her dresser. Pointedly avoiding the mirror while in her underclothes, Ayase changed and made sure the t-shirt wasn't too short. A comb through her hair, a snatch of keys and wallet, and she was off. She made sure to close and lock her dorm room behind her. She arrived at the student lounge at 5:33. Sachi waited by the entrance, a big smile on his face.
Hey,
he said. Hey. He had dressed up a little in a green buttoned shirt that shimmered in the light. It was flashy, but it didn't look out of place on him. It made Ayase's clothes feel especially plain, which actually comforted her.
Joe's not here yet,
Sachi told her. He glanced at her shirt and smiled.
You look nice.
Ayase shot him a skeptical look. It's a t-shirt, she murmured. You don't have to try that hard, Sachi. Sachi laughed.
Whoa,
he called, holding his hands out.
Easy. I just mean red's your color.
When his dark eyes focused on her again, they glittered with something new.
You're right. I'm trying too hard. Sorry.
Ayase felt something swirl in her stomach. Was she imagining things, or was he looking at her differently? As she glanced into his eyes, his lips closed beneath them in a small smile. She wasn't quite sure what to say. She suddenly noticed Joe. Sachi followed her gaze and turned. His eyes fell on the student with Joe and immediately lit up.
Kiyoshi!
Joe's roommate blinked. He brushed 2 long, 2 thick bangs from his eyes and refocused his gaze.
Sachi?
Sachi bounded up to Kiyoshi and held out a fist.
What's up, man? I didn't know you came to Fukahashi.
Kiyoshi tentatively knocked fists.
Yeah.
He said after a moment.
It's, good to see you.
That's Joe's roommate? Kiyoshi was taller and more filled out than Joe. Ayase noticed lean muscle on the wiry arms that poked out from his short sleeves. She'd never seen a student so direly in need of a haircut, as his shaggy hair fell into his eyes and nearly hid his pupils from view.
So where are we going?
Koshi asked.
Blue Light, that new place in Harajuku.
Koshi's eyes widened.
A club?
He blurted.
I can't dance.
He turned to Joe quickly.
Why didn't you tell me?
Joe lit a cigarette. He was head to toe in black with a pair of red-tint sunglasses. His eyes rolled to Koshi from beneath the shades.
Your friend wanted to see you. Does it matter where we're going?
He pocketed his lighter.
You guys should take this opportunity to catch up. I can entertain myself once we get there.
Sachi gestured to Joe's cigarette.
You're not supposed to smoke in the lounge, Joe.
Then let's go.
Joe blew smoke from the curves of his mouth and made for the exit. As they all followed, Ayase found herself beside Koshi and looking into his half-hidden eyes. I'm Ayase, she told him. Koshi, right? He nodded. Don't worry. She shook her head. I can't dance either.
The trip to the club was uneventful. The four of them took the subway, but as Joe tried to catch a few minutes of sleep, that Sachi kid yammered like a 4-year-old. Joe leaned his head against the back of his seat and closed his eyes.
What kind of music do you like, Ayase?
No preference, really.
Any dance? Techno?
Not really.
They mostly play techno at Blue Light. It can get pretty loud in the place. You'll be okay, right?
What?
Do you mind loud music? I once brought this kid to a club and he couldn't take the noise. I like to check first now.
I'll be fine.
Do you dance?
No.
Do you want to try?
No.
Are you sure? I'll go out on the dance floor with you if it'll make you feel better.
Joe frowned. She's a lost friggin' cause, he wanted to say. He was more polite than that. The Ayase girl wasn't exactly a talker, and as Sachi pulled Koshi into his chatter, Joe's roommate didn't prove much better. Based on the conversation, Joe guessed Koshi and Sachi hadn't known each other very well in junior high. At least Joe was left alone. His brilliant plan to use his roommate to shield him from Sachi's banter was working. He couldn't sleep because of the blabbering, but he preferred that to playing an unending game of 20 questions. When they at last reached the club, Joe had to admit that he was impressed. At 6:10 on the first day of school, the place was swarming with teenagers. The club itself still had that new feel to it, and the pulsing music wasn't bad. As he flashed his student ID for entrance and stepped into the dark, multicolored atmosphere, he couldn't help but smile, dipping in a damn money jar.
Joe?
He heard Sachi call over the music.
Do you want to leave with us tonight?
Joe hadn't paid attention to directions. Sure, he answered.
Then what, 9? By the entrance?
Sounds good.
Okay, have a good time.
Joe waved a few fingers behind him as he melted into the crowd. Within a few minutes, he'd already recognized a number of kids from school, a few even in their uniforms. In the dark and the dancing and the laughing and the music, Joe's hands moved undetectably. He snagged a wallet before he even finished his survey. He cracked his knuckles. It was going to be a good night. As his eyes followed a student who seemed particularly off guard, Joe bumped into someone. He murmured an apology and tried to slide past, then suddenly realized why they'd collided. The other guy stood dead still in the crowd, alone. Joe paused a moment and nudged his shades down. The guy looked vaguely familiar and even seemed to be shaking. What the hell? Joe thought. He leaned in and tapped the guy on the arm. Hey, Joe said. You okay? You need me to get a bouncer? The guy jerked at the touch. When he whipped his head around, Joe stopped. It was the boy from the back of his homeroom, the zombie one. He seemed worse than he'd been in school, and was visibly pale in the flickering lights. He looked strung out as all hell. Joe could only stare for a second. When he regained himself, he blurted, "Did something happen to you? You look like shit." The kid glared daggers.
Leave me alone,
he snapped. Even under the noise, Joe could hear the slight cracking to the classmate's voice. A part of Joe knew he should leave well enough alone, but another, louder part of himself was morbidly curious. That, and Joe was flashing back to an old foster brother from years ago. A 10-year-old boy with that look in his eyes, and stories of how his birth mother punished him when he was bad. Joe pushed closer. The classmate tried to duck away, but Joe grabbed his arm. "Look," Joe muttered close enough so only the boy would hear. "I'm in your homeroom, okay? Don't freak out. Are you coming down off something? Do you need a doctor?" Joe barely saw the fist coming in time. He swung his head aside, but the guy's knuckles still knocked his chin. Joe slapped a hand over the forming bruise, and in doing so released his classmate, who left. The boy pushed his way through the crowd, disappearing into the throng. Joe grimaced and tested out his jaw. He could tell without a mirror that the fist would leave a mark. Damn, he thought as he massaged his face. Way to be an asshole. No matter what the guy was going through, Joe had been pretty damn non-threatening. He certainly didn't deserve that kind of treatment from a classmate. Oh well, he'd tried. And what was it his first foster mother always said? No good deed goes unpunished. Which is why I shouldn't bother. Joe adjusted his crooked sunglasses.
Sachi left Ayase and Kiyoshi alone for a while. He'd seen more kids he knew, and besides, he said he wanted Ayase and Kiyoshi to relax and get to know the place. Ayase guessed Sachi would try to get her to dance later, but she sincerely didn't want to. At least Kiyoshi seemed as quiet and out of place as she. The two of them stood against the wall and watched the dancers pulse to the throbbing beat. For a good 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. When Kiyoshi at last pulled a few candies from his pocket and offered one to her, her decline was the first thing she'd said to him since leaving the school lounge. This is stupid, Ayase thought as Kiyoshi popped the candy into his mouth. I never planned to be this antisocial. Making a few acquaintances wasn't the end of the world, right? She'd had some in middle school, after all. She slid her hands into her pockets and looked out at the crowd. Do you, play sports, Kiyoshi? He glanced at her. Your shirt, it's got that swish thing on it. He looked down at his tea.
Oh.
He frowned.
Joe didn't tell me where we were going, but it's not like I have clubbing clothes anyway.
Ayase waited.
Soccer.
He pushed another candy into his mouth.
Yeah, I did archery at junior high, but I'm gonna play soccer at Fukuhashi.
Silence. Ayase tried to think of something else to say, but came up with nothing. Kiyoshi kept chewing and didn't make any effort to speak. His eyes wandered a bit around the crowds, finally resting on a bar further in the club. He froze. And choked. Ayase turned to him as he started coughing and clutching at his throat. Hey, she said, reaching out as he doubled over. He started hacking and her eyes widened. Hey, she leaned in. Are you okay? He nodded in between gags. He coughed loudly into his palm to clear his airway, then closed his hand over the lump of half-chewed candy. Ayase frowned. What was that? He shook his head, his eyes watery in the dancing lights.
You were just down the wrong tube.
He wheezed as he wiped his mouth.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom and drink something.
Okay. She watched him as he stumbled towards the bathrooms. Confused, Ayase turned in the direction of the bar. It was too far. As she squinted against the darkness and the colors, she wondered if he'd seen something, but wondered how he could see anything at that distance, in that light. She eventually gave up and leaned back against the wall. A few minutes passed, but Kiyoshi didn't return. Ayase glanced back toward the bar to see a few people leaving it. Still curious, she watched as they walked closer, revealing themselves to be a group of several girls. They looked about her age, and seeing one girl's blatant dye job, they were probably from her school. But nothing particularly interesting caught Ayase's eye. The girls passed by without incident. Ayase sighed. Okay, now she was really lame. The life and times of the people at the bar were actually keeping her attention. I don't belong here. Ayase slumped against the wall. She couldn't relax in this place. She could never really relax around other people, not since she was little. No matter her level of control, she was still afraid she'd slip up someday. She'd be scared or something, like that day in class. She'd get surprised and her control would break, and before she knew it, her body would... She squeezed shut her eyes against the thought. Not now, she told herself. She hadn't had a real slip-up since she was a little kid, and things were only slightly worse now with the stress of changing schools. She'd get stronger soon. Things would get better. Ayase suddenly realized Kiyoshi was still gone. She checked her watch. It had been almost 20 minutes. The club was pretty big. Had he forgotten where they'd been standing? She pushed herself from the wall and went to find him. Following in Kiyoshi's footsteps proved surprisingly difficult. The club was growing more and more packed as time passed, and she needed to cut through the dancers to slip into the hallway in the back. A few kids lounged in the small corridor, and she had to pick her way around them, but the hallway grew more deserted as she traveled further. She took a left fork and found the restrooms. She knocked on the sign marked men's. Hello? She pushed her ear near the door. Kiyoshi? She heard nothing. After another knock, she pushed open the door and peeked inside. The bathroom was deserted. No boys, no Kiyoshi, no nothing. She frowned. Maybe he had gotten lost among the people. As she walked back down the hall, she found herself stopping at the fork. Maybe he'd simply taken a wrong turn on the way back from the bathrooms? Figuring it was worth a shot, she started down the deserted second hall. After the third turn, she guessed Kiyoshi hadn't come that far. He would have realized he was going the wrong way at that point. She turned to leave, then stopped. Voices. Despite the muffled throbbing of the music in the deep hallway, she definitely heard speaking from further in. She tentatively took a few more steps. The voices grew louder, and she came to hear the edges of the words.
Bullshit, Suzuki. This isn't. You know what the fuck you're talking about. This is good shit.
A shiver traveled down Ayase's spine. Of all the doors lined up along the hall, the conversation came from one of the last. The voices rose in volume a bit and exchanged more curses. Again, a bad feeling swirled in her stomach. She stared down the hall and pursed her lips. A big hand clapped over her mouth. As hot shock raced through her, she felt the edges of her body release. No! She squeezed shut her eyes and slammed her self-control together. As her heart raced and she felt her body lock into its form again, she dug her nails into her attacker's hand and drove her teeth into his palm. Something hard hit the back of her head. Before the world blinked out around her, the last thing she saw was a single shining insect break free from her falling arm.